incredibly pleased to introduce Alison Gopnik, who was gracious enough to agree. Hi, come in, come in. Okay, so I'm going to start again. So Alison Gopnik, scholar, psychologist, now almost a computer scientist, so AI specialist, has agreed to come and give us a talk about some, I guess, insights from child development that might be important for us to know about. And she's, every talk of her is a huge pleasure. This is going to be twice this week. I'm like, thank you.
You will have heard some of it before. Thank you very much. I feel like I'm a bit of an interloper in this group, but I think that, yes, that's right. So, but I think there are some interesting parallels between what we do as developmental psychologists and what comparative psychologists do, and to this general project of trying to use data to figure out something about the understanding of agents that we know are not like kind of typical adults. So how could we actually do that? And one of the things that I want to suggest is that there's some morals that you can get from thinking about children and more generally thinking about development that are relevant for the project that you're all engaged in. And in particular, if you look at a very old, ancient, going back to Aristotle way of thinking about both relationships, comparative relationships among different animals, and also thinking about development is what's called the scala natura. And that's the idea that there's some single measure, something like general intelligence, and that some creatures are higher up on that scale of intelligence than others. And that you can kind of have a ladder of how intelligent these creatures are. And fairly obviously, humans tend to put themselves at the top of the ladder. Although, to be fair, in the original versions, angels are even higher up on the ladder than humans are. And then there's various kinds of rankings of where the other creatures are. And you see the same thing in development. So it's a common trope to think about, say, child development as being there's an adult, oddly enough, usually like a 35-year-old white male psychologist who's the pinnacle of all of intelligence, and everything else is just kind of either building up to him or falling off from him, which doesn't make very much sense from an evolutionary perspective. So that's a very common picture. And unfortunately, I think it's been particularly common in the AI community, where the very notion that there's this thing called artificial general intelligence, and you can have a little bit of it or you can have a lot of it. And as you get more and more of it, you're going to be more and more powerful and more influential. And that the role of artificial intelligence research is to try and get things that have more and more of this mysterious thing called intelligence. And then you can go out and measure how much of this mysterious thing called intelligence does, say, an LLM have compared to people or compared to non-human animals and so forth. And as I suppose will already be obvious, I think this is just completely the wrong way of thinking about intelligence. And again, I think people in comparative intelligence, in the workshop that I was just in that Shafi was talking about, we had Amanda Seed and Lucy Cheek, who are comparative cognition people. I think they very much recognize this. So it's an important point that the right way to think about intelligence and behavior in general in non-human animals is not how good are they, how close are they to what humans can do, even though that's a very tempting way to think. Do they have theory of mind? Do they have language? Do they have recursion? Here's a bunch of things that we have. Do they have some approximation to those? And I think the general wisdom, which I would imagine that everyone here would share, is the right way to think about it is that animals are adapted to a particular kind of ecological niche. They have cognitive capacities that are designed to deal with that niche. And those may be very diverse, very different across different times and places and niches. And there isn't going to be any kind of scale you can make about which ones are better or more sophisticated or more complex or more intelligent than others. So that's the sort of general principle that I want to have. So when I give talks at AI conferences, I start out with a slide that says there's just no such thing as general intelligence, natural or artificial. And there's usually a sharp intake of breath from the audience, and there's a sort of implicit sort of don't tell the VCs that, right? That's the underlying that's the underlying message. But I think it's not just that there are different intelligences for different niches, but that we can actually say something about the way that different kinds of intelligences not only are different, but actually trade off against one another. So the picture here is that rather than thinking even about having different intelligences, there are different types of cognitive capacities, and they provably intrinsically trade off against each other. So it's impossible to have artificial general intelligence. The idea that you could just maximize one of these functions doesn't work, because if you did, you'd be affecting all these other kinds of cognitive functions. So that's the general argument that I want to make. And I'm going to make it in the context of thinking about human development, but I'm also going to be talking about development in general across many different species. And the important point that I want to make is that these kinds of intelligences really play off of each other. And if you're doing the project that the people here are doing, which is trying to take a bunch of data and infer something about what the underlying cognitive capacities or the underlying intentions are of animals, you have to think about which kind of intelligence or which kind of communication, which kind of behavior you think these animals are engaging in. And that's not going to just be obvious from on the surface. So let me talk a little bit about some of these intelligences. So in the particular case of human development, of what's called life history, what you can see is these three quite different kinds of capacities, very different kinds of intelligence and cognition that are related to different developmental periods. So to sort of think about it roughly, there's a period of exploitation, and this is the sort of thing that typically is focused on in AI. You have creatures that are going out and trying to maximize their utilities, go out and find mates, find ways to deal with the pecking order and the hierarchy and get resources and maximize utilities. And then you could ask, what kinds of cognitive capacities do you need to solve those kinds of tasks? And of course, something like reinforcement learning is an example of a cognitive capacity that's just designed to try and solve those kinds of tasks. But that kind of ability is in tension with another kind of ability, which is just the ability to explore. In particular, the ability to figure out what the structure of your environment is. And I think even more importantly, to figure out the range of possible interactions that you could have with this environment. So this isn't just what's the best policy that will maximize utility, but what's the range of policies over a long period of time that I could have that would, in the long run, maybe maximize utilities, but the objective, if you're doing exploration, is not the long run, it's the short run. And very often what you're going to have to do is sacrifice short run utility in the service of exploration. And that exploitation-exploration contrast is one that's very well understood. It's been talked about a lot in the computational and neurological literature. And as I say, provably, these two things are in tension. You can't maximize both of them at the same time. The third one that I'm going to talk about, though, is a bit different and hasn't been explored as much. And this is the kind of intelligence that comes with what I'm thinking of as both a care and a teaching or transmission niche. And this is very relevant for this project because, as we'll see, one of the kinds of categories of animals that we know seem to be especially likely to engage in this kind of care and transmission is cetaceans. So the two groups that we know of that are particularly good at care and teaching seem to be humans and cetaceans. So what's this about? This is a niche where you're not using cognition to maximize your utilities. As we'll see, in some ways, what you're doing is negatively affecting your utilities, but you're doing it in the service of the next generation. So what you're doing is you're trying to do something that will enable another organism, and usually next generation of organisms, to actually succeed and thrive. And very often in humans, this is in the context of trying to transmit cultural information, discoveries that you've made, et cetera, to the next generation. And that also is very much in tension, as I'll argue a little bit later on, with the exploit objective. So if what you're trying to do is help somebody else, and in particular, if what you're trying to do is transmit the information that you already have to somebody else, that's going to be really different from exploiting that information to get resources on the one hand, or obtaining that information in the first place through exploration. So those are going to be really different cognitive capacities, and to some extent are actually going to be, in fact, to a large extent, are going to be in tension with one another. And this idea of multiple intelligences, you might ask, okay, I said if you're trying to think about animals, you might want to think about what their ecological niche is. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence that the ecological niche for humans was the non-stationary environment. So this is a picture about climate variation across time. And now humans are causing climate change, but in the past, climate change caused humans. So what you see is that at the point when humans are evolving, the climate becomes much less predictable. And it's much less predictable on a human scale. So, every 10 years, you were seeing big changes in the climate. And then because humans were always nomadic, that increased the non-stationarity of the environment. And because the way that humans adapted to the non-stationary environment was by producing culture, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, that meant that the environment was even more non-stationary. So humans are adapted to a very unpredictable, changing, non-stationary niche. And that may also, I think this is a really interesting way of thinking about how other animals are adapted as well. And the way that you seem to adapt to this kind of non-stationarity, this is, by the way, a issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, where I and a number of other biologists and psychologists talked about this, is by having a life history. So by having these different kinds of developmental periods with different kinds of cognitive capacities, that seems to be a way of dealing with an unpredictable non-stationary environment. If you're in a very predictable, regular environment, then you can just innately have the same kinds of structures that you're going to need for your entire life and for the entire life of your offspring. And you can, of course, be extremely successful by adapting to the environment in that way. But if you don't know what the environment is going to be like within your own lifespan, and especially within the lifespan of your offspring, then you have to use a really different kind of strategy. And in fact, empirically, if you look across many different kinds of animals, what you see is that there's this really striking relationship between how long a period of childhood in particular an organism has and how what we would anthropomorphically call intelligent, how good at learning, how flexible, how large a brain the adult animal has. And humans, of course, are kind of at the end of the distribution on all of these measures. This is a chimp in the Gombe, and by the time this chimp is 7, the chimp will be producing as much food as he's consuming. And in humans, even in foragers, that doesn't happen until at least late adolescence, 15 or 16. And in industrial societies, my son is 35, and we're still writing tuition checks and tuition and rent checks. And it turns out that this relation, and of course there's something paradoxical about this, because this period of immaturity is really costly, right? I mean, the definition of childhood is that these are creatures that aren't capable of taking care of themselves, that they need resources from other members of the community. And that might seem like a really weird, paradoxical kind of thing to do in the first place, and extending it to a longer and longer period seems even more weird and paradoxical. Nevertheless, you see this relationship remarkably strongly across a very wide range of different kinds of animals and organisms. So this is a chart just looking at primates. And again, intelligence here is a somewhat loaded word. What it really means is capacity for learning and flexibility. And the humans are way off on the edge of that graph. But in fact, the first place that people saw this relationship between life history and learning was in birds. So if you compare the domestic chicken, the chicken is mature in about 2 weeks, and compare that to, say, the New Caledonian crow that takes about 2 years to fledge. So it's 2 years where it's dependent on adults for its food. And the chickens, in fact, it's interesting. The chickens are very well adapted to a small set of tasks like pecking for grain. And there's some recent evidence that literally from the time the chickens are born, they have the cognitive capacities in place that they're going to use for the rest of their lives to accomplish the tasks that they need to accomplish. It's kind of sweet. I used to present this talk, and I think I will still present this talk by saying, like, the chickens are really stupid and the crows and corvids are really smart. And basically, like, all the comparatives that I know would sort of pretty much agree with that. A better way of putting it is that chickens are adapted to one particular niche. These New Caledonian crows, on the other hand, and crows and corvids in general, are extremely smart birds. They're up to chimpanzee level in things like tool use. They can take novel tools and change them. I'm sure everybody in the room knows something about how smart the New Caledonian crows are. So as I say, I used to say, and still will say, yeah, the chickens are basically stupid and the crows are really smart. What I discovered is that, as I say, this is a little sweet. The guys in the valley raise chickens in their backyards. That's like a hobby. And one of the things that I'll say in a minute is when you care for something, you start to really value it. So if you raise chickens, you don't like to think of them as being stupid. So I've gotten pushback from people who are raising chickens and caring for chickens about the idea that they're not as smart as crows. It turns out this is not only true for, so in the context of thinking about birds, there's this contrast between altricial species, like the crows, and precocial species, like the chickens, and there's a whole biological narrative about the difference between these two kinds of species. It turns out that this is even true for insects. So there's this really beautiful work by evolutionary biologist Emily Snell-Root, who's looked at cabbage white butterflies. And again, I hate to say this to anyone who's looking after butterflies, but butterflies are like even dumber than chickens. They basically do not have very sophisticated cognitive capacities. And if you've read The Very Hungry Caterpillar, you know all about caterpillar butterfly life history. The Very Hungry Caterpillar just encapsulates it. The caterpillar the caterpillar finds a nice green leaf and it eats the green leaf over 6 days, probably doesn't do cupcakes and sausages the way the Very Hungry Caterpillar does, but that's pretty much the story. And then at the end of the period of eating the nice green leaf, it turns into a beautiful, beautiful butterfly. And then the butterfly goes off and lays eggs on another leaf and the process continues. But what Emily discovered is that even among like individual butterflies, some of them have a strategy of just find a green leaf and land on it and lay their eggs. So this is cabbage white. The reason why cabbage whites are a menace is because they find something like kale and lay their eggs on the kale and that's it. And then there are other cabbage whites that actually flit around much more from different kinds of sources. They like the green leaves, but they'll actually land on different kinds of leaves and then test for the chemical composition of the leaves, and they'll lay eggs on leaves that aren't green if they have the right kind, if they're getting the right kind of signals about the chemical composition. And these other butterflies also will not lay eggs if there are already eggs on the leaf that another butterfly has laid. So this butterfly is just an instinct. You go to the green leaf, you lay your egg, and this one is actually doing something that looks more like learning or decision making. And it turns out that the developmental trajectory for the ones that are laying the eggs is that they produce twice as many eggs, and the eggs mature much more quickly than the ones that are the ones that are flitting around. There also is probably, I think, a message there about the intelligence that's indicated by just eating kale, but that's another story. And we see, as I say, we see this pattern of early life history, this pattern of this distinctive life history that contributes to particular kinds of intelligence in neural development as well. So absolute boilerplate for humans and for other animals as well is that in the course of brain development, you see this early period where there's lots of synaptic connections, lots of synaptic plasticity. And then what happens is that there's a tipping point where the connections that have already been formed are strengthened, myelinated, become more efficient. And then connections that haven't been made are pruned. And what this means is that you have really two brains. You have an early brain that's very well adapted for learning and plasticity, not very well adapted for executive function, for long-term planning, for action. And then you have this later brain that's very well adapted for action, not as well adapted for plasticity, for learning, for changing under new circumstances. And it's the combination, as it were, of those two brains in one organism that actually allows humans, for example, to be as effective as they are. And I think it's kind of interesting that if you look in the AI world, even though this architecture is the one that's absolutely ubiquitous in biology, it's not one that people have adapted in AI, for example. And in fact, we have fossil evidence for this relationship between long childhood and hominin evolution. So if you look at two samples, you can see that that you're getting faster maturation, even comparing, say, Neanderthals versus Homo sapiens. And I want to emphasize again that this kind of this pattern is expensive. So this is a favorite graph of mine. This is from Chris Kuzawa, and he actually looked at glucose use over time. And what he discovered, so it's well known that brains are expensive computing gadgets. So as you're sitting here right now, your brain's using up about 20% of your calories. But when you were 4, your brain was using up almost 70% of your calories. So not only are children expensive in the sense that they need you to take care of them and keep them out of trouble, but they're literally expensive. They're literally calorically extremely expensive. I like this partly because I think it is a nice vision of, my 3-year-old grandson is basically this incredibly hungry brain perched on these little arms and legs that goes around the world trying to feed its brain and hypnotizing all the rest of us into just spending all our time feeding the giant brain. That's a pretty good description of Thela. Okay, so one question you might have is, why find this architecture everywhere? Why do you have this childhood at all if it's so expensive? Why do you see this relationship? And one idea that I've argued for is that you can think about this in terms of a classic AI explore-exploit trade-off. And there's lots of different versions of this idea of the explore-exploit trade-off. But one version that you get in things like optimality theory, it describes this trade-off in terms of an idea of temperature. So the idea is, think about some problem that you're trying to solve. You have, a big box of potential solutions to this problem. You're at this place in the space. It's a big, complicated, high-dimensional space. How can you get to the parts of the space where there are better solutions? And one thing you could do is you could just make small changes to where you already are. You could do something like hill climbing to try and solve this problem. And that's going to get you a pretty decent solution pretty quickly. But the disadvantage of that is there might be a much better solution that's much further out in the space, and you're not going to be able to get to that better solution. On the other hand, so that's the low temperature search. Think about it as if you were a molecule in an atmosphere. On the other hand, what you can do is you can have a lot more randomness and noise in what you're doing. You can bounce around the space. And that has the advantage that you're more likely to settle to find a low probability, initially low probability solution. But of course, it has the disadvantage that you're going to be bouncing around, and most of the solutions that you're going to come to are not actually going to be useful. And the way that this tension is typically resolved in computer science, or at least one way of resolving it, is something called simulated annealing. And the way that simulated annealing works is that you start out with a high temperature, and then you cool off. So you can see this is an example where you're trying to find this is a very simple space. You're just trying to find the highest point in this space. But if you were just doing a local search like hill climbing, you'll get stuck in these local optima, these local minima, right? You'll move this way and you'll say, oh, it's not getting any better. You'll move this way and say it's not getting any better. And you won't find out that if you came over here, you actually could solve the problem. So the way simulated annealing works is you start out with this really high temperature search, looking through the whole space and moving around a lot. And then gradually you cool off and settle on the better solution. So my hypothesis is that childhood is evolution's way of performing simulated annealing. So you have this early period where you have a lot of high temperature, noisy, unpredictable behavior, not very good for actually doing anything. And then you have this later period where you're not as flexible, you're not searching the space as much, you're taking the things that you learned when you were searching the space and just figuring out how to implement them. And for purposes of this group in particular, I want to emphasize that what this means is that properties of, say, an animal's behavior or cognition that are features from the perspective of exploit may be bugs from the perspective of explore, and vice versa. So one that I think is particularly relevant for you is this noise feature, right? So what kind of assumption do you make about how noisy the behavior or the signal or the communication of an animal is? That noise might be really different depending on whether the animal's in an explore mode or an exploit mode. So having really noisy behavior is a good thing if you're trying to explore the space. It's a bad thing if you're just trying to narrow the channel of communication. So if you were thinking about it from the grown-up exploit point of view, you might think, okay, what I want to do is get rid of all the noise. I just want to look for the signal. But if you're looking at, say, a 3-year-old and you get rid of the noise, you're going to be missing what actually is making that 3-year-old's behavior or language informative and useful, and is enabling them to use that behavior to explore. And that's going to be true about a bunch of other kinds of features that are characteristic of not just young humans, but young animals in general, like risk-taking and impulsivity. And in fact, empirically, most of the time, if you give a task to older people, they'll do better than younger ones because they know how a lab works in an experiment. But it turns out that especially in cases where the solution is not obvious, where it's unlikely, you're more likely to you actually see children doing better at solving these kinds of tasks than adults are among humans. And we've done a whole bunch of this work, and then there's a bunch of other people who've done this work too. So these things that you might think are going to make children, and have traditionally made people think that children are being irrational or limited, or they're showing lack of intelligence, actually can help if you're trying to solve these kinds of high dimensional problems. And there's a lovely recent paper that actually demonstrates that these changes in learning are like the annealing optimization kinds of changes. Okay, so now let me get to the other side. So one thing that you have to think about is that you need to think about whether what an organism or an animal is doing is best characterized in terms of exploit or explore, and that will have a big difference on many, many features of their behavior and cognition. But then the third part that I was talking about was the care/teaching part. And to demonstrate this, I'll give you an example of my all-time favorite experiment in psychology. So that early period of childhood, as I've said a couple of times, depends on having other organisms, other animals that will take care of you during that very dependent, helpless period of childhood. And here's the experiment. We all know it's Psychology 101 that you put a rat in a maze and it goes down one arm of the maze and it gets shocked. It goes down the other arm of the maze, nothing happens. It won't go down the arm of the maze where it got shocked. That's, as I say, Psych 101. That's the basis for all of reinforcement learning in AI. But it turns out that that is true for adult rats, but it's not true for juvenile rats. So if you look at juvenile rats, they actually prefer the arm that leads to the shock. And Nim Tottenham recently did a study that showed that the same thing's true with 3- and 4-year-old children. And anyone who's had a 2-year-old or a teenager, this will sound familiar. But there's so this is a very nice example of this explore exploit shift with development that I was talking about before. Because of course, what happens is if you go down the arm that has the shock, your utilities aren't improving, but your information is improving. So now you know something new that you didn't know about the environment. So that's a good thing to do from the explore perspective. And a little digression here, as I've been working recently on the idea that empowerment, which is a kind of idea that comes in reinforcement learning for a kind of intrinsic reward that's about, can I predict what the outcomes of my actions are going to be, trying to use that to characterize what's going on with young children. And I think that's something to talk about. So going down the maze that leads to the shock is more informative and more empowering. It tells you about what the consequences of your actions are going to be, even though in the short run, it's leading to this negative utility. Okay, so this is a nice part of the explore exploit case, but there's a really interesting twitch to this, and really interesting feature of it, which is that the juveniles will only do it if the mother is present. And that's true for the rats, and it's also true for the children. And with the rats, it's even like the smell of the mother is present. So they've got indications that the mother is present. But then there's an even nicer extra twist, which is, at least for the rats, they won't do it if the mother has been fear conditioned. So in other words, if the mother's, and particularly with rats, it's all olfactory, if the mother's smell is the smell of a frightened rat, then the rats won't go down the arm of the maze that leads to the shock. So the presence of the mother is serving as a signal about whether exploration is possible or not, whether it's, whether even if there's a bad utility in the first place, you're not going to die as a result of doing this kind of exploration. And as I imagine all of you are already thinking, I think this has all sorts of wonderful implications for thinking about parenting, and that you should be the mom who's sitting there calmly watching the child go to the top of the tall slide, which is a difficult thing for all of us to do. But it also suggests that there's something about this care piece, about knowing that someone's a caregiver, that's acting to enable this kind of exploration. And we have a big project now that's actually, I think, beginning to demonstrate this systematically. And that leads me to the other part of the developmental, trajectory. So you've got this period of childhood that seems sort of paradoxically helpless and needy, but then you've also got this period of elderhood. And in humans in particular, and interestingly also in cetaceans like orcas, a point I'll get to in a minute, this is really vivid because you have postmenopausal grandmotherhood. So you have women who are not literally not reproducing anymore, not fertile anymore, and yet they're living characteristically for another 20 years. And this is true independently of medical care and so forth. This is true for foragers as well as for contemporary societies. So why would this be? Why do you have a period of elderhood characterized by these exploit deficits? Right, go back to that 35-year-old psychologist. Why would you have that period? And this is something that's very, very understudied. This is a paper that's just come out in Daedalus, and we have a special issue of Daedalus coming out looking at it. You could read philosophy, economics, biology, political economy, moral psychology, cognitive science, and have no idea that there's a really, really important function for human beings, which is taking care of other human beings. In particular, you could have no idea that caring for children and caring for elders is something that's a really important part of human life. To go back to the examples of the across different species, remember the crows and the chickens. It turns out that parental investment is also predictive of brain size. So, for example, if you look at these, this is yet another animal group. If you look at these marsupials, this is a Virginia possum. The possums have big litters of 7 or 8 babies at once. The babies are only mature for a relatively brief time, and the biological mother is the only one who actually takes care of those babies. If you compare this, this is the quokka, the world's cutest animal, lives on a little island in Australia. And the quokkas have both, they have pair bonding, so they have both fathers and mothers looking after babies. That's quite rare. It's only about 5% of mammals that have this kind of male pair bonding. And the baby stays in the pouch for as long as a year. And even though the quokkas and the possums are the same size, the quokkas' brains are twice as big as the possum's brains are. We don't quite know what they do with the brains, but they seem to have that. They seem to have that niche. Now, as I often point out, for humans, I suspect mothers often feel more like they look like this than they look like that. We could all use more backlighting in our lives. But actually, we're more like the quokkas. So we have more parental investment. And in fact, we have what I think of as the parental investment triple threat. If you compare us, say, with our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, we have pair bonded fathers, as I mentioned before, like the quokkas, unlike chimps and gorillas and other primates. We have alloparents, so we have people who are not kin, who are nevertheless taking care of babies and children. And we have my personal favorite, grandmothers. And you can see lurking behind those three beautiful children, there's a postmenopausal grandmother. And we know that grandmothers are crucial to provisioning those children. They're the thing that allows that long childhood to take place. And care is, by the way, I highly recommend this book, which by Patricia Churchland, who's a philosopher, who talks about some of this. Care, like exploration, care is kind of paradoxical from the exploit perspective. Because if you think about what we're doing in a social context from the exploit perspective, right? You're going out, you're trying to maximize your utilities, you have resources, you meet another agent who's trying to maximize their resources, they have utilities. What's going to happen? Well, one thing that can happen is you can swap resources to maximize your utilities. That's the social contract. It's the basis of all the evolutionary theories of the evolution of altruism. It's the basis of markets. It's the basis of democracy. It's the basis of economics. Another thing that can happen is you have one agent who has many more resources and capacities than the other agent. So they have more power. And surprise, surprise, the second agent subordinates their goals and utilities to those of the first agent. So that's, we all, like we all know about the social contract from Adam Smith, and we all know about power relationships from Karl Marx. But what happens in a care relationship? Well, what happens in a care relationship is that you have two agents, and one of them has more resources and capacities, one of them doesn't. And because the second agent doesn't have resources and capacities, the first agent gives up their resources and capacities in favor of the second agent's goals. And that's the structure of care for children, for elders, for people who are ill across a wide range of different settings. But again, it's very, very different from what you would think of as the usual structure of social interaction. And again, I think the moral for the people in this room is, if you're looking at especially animals like whales that have complicated social relationships and that have very high levels of care, you might really misinterpret those behaviors if you have a model like classic reinforcement learning that's based on the idea that what agents are trying to do is maximizing their utilities. So looking at care through the lens of utility theory, for example, or economics, might really mislead you about what is going on or what the signals are that the agents are producing. And again, we know a lot about things like dominance hierarchies, which are really these kind of power relationships. And we know something about these contractual relationships, but we know much less about these care parental relationships, even though they seem to be really, really important for any kind of complicated social intelligent agent. And then a last thing to say about this, again, very relevant to this group, to go back to that grandmother. What she's doing is there's a bunch of, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that she's made for these kids in the other room. But it turns out that this picture is actually a really good illustration of the next point that I want to make, because this grandmother is actually reading a 100-year-old copy of Now We Are Seven by A. M. Milne to these children, because this grandmother likes collecting antique children's books. So what these children are getting is 100 years worth of knowledge about what it's like to be a little child through the grandmother sitting and reading to them. And it turns out that if you're thinking about, so this other capacity is this capacity for culture. And there's quite a lot of evidence that the elders are also, in addition to caring, they're transmitting information. What they're doing is teaching the next generation something about the big, especially about the big important things in the culture, and doing it through media like, for humans, like stories. And there's quite a lot of some nice anthropological evidence that that elders are particularly well adapted to do this. So Polly Wiesner has these beautiful analyses of the kind of, again, relevant to this group, the kind of communication that's going on through the day among humans in a forager hunter-gatherer community. And what you see is that during the day, most of the communication is sort of functional. It's coordinating joint action, it's people working together. Rather depressingly, about 50% of it is what she calls criticism and complaint. So a lot of it is about, a lot of the communication is, why is it that you never actually do this right? You know, why are the other members of the search committee so useless? So now when I go home and talk to my husband, I say, you know, it was a great day. Like only about 40% of it was criticism and complaint. But at night, when people are sitting around the fire, the pragmatic character of the communication completely changes. And now it's elders, grandmothers, and grandfathers who are sitting around the fire and telling stories to kids. So now the kids and the grandmothers are the ones who are doing the communication. And now the communication is about, here's the myths that we have, here's the stories that we have, here's what's important to us in our culture, here's what happened a long time ago, here's what happened far away. Those are the kinds of information that are getting passed on. So again, if you're not, if you were just looking at those humans and thinking, all right, they are communicating, right? They're talking, and you tried to use the same methods for understanding what was going on in the day with the complaint and coordination, and what was going on at night, where it's elders, grandmothers who've kind of given up on actually getting the search committee to do the thing it's supposed to, and are just telling the graduate students stories about what it was like when they were a young assistant professor. Then you'll get a very different kind of picture of what that communication is like. And let me just mention, again, in the context of this group, it's fascinating that the cetaceans are the other group that we know of that really has this pattern of having grandmothers. And for a long time, when I would give these talks, I would say, orcas, grandmothers, like, who knows why? Why do they have postmenopausal grandmothers? And of course, one of the things that's been discovered more recently is that they also have these really distinctive forms of cultural transmission. So these grandmothers are going out and giving the grandchildren information about where the krill could be found, or what kind of food sources are the best food sources. And the grandmothers also seem to be the sort of locus for this kind of cultural transmission. And again, importantly, this is a kind of trade-off, because if you're spending your time leading other animals, especially young ones, to the sources of food, that means you're not actually putting all your energy into getting the food yourself. And this will be the last slide. And there's some lovely evidence, again, from the anthropologist Michael Gervin, who showed that when you look at hunting is this very high skilled activity. And what you see is that it takes till you're about 35 to become a really good hunter. And what happens is when you look at parties that are going out and hunting, the 35-year-olds are just going out in a solitary way, and they're the most effective hunters and they bring back the most meat. But the boys and the grandfathers are going out together. And what that means is the grandfathers have much more knowledge and information than the 35-year-olds, but they're not as strong and they're not as effective hunters. The kids, the 14-year-olds, don't have either as much, are starting to have more strength, but they don't have the information. And the combination of the elders and the children going out together enables this cultural transmission to take place, which is the thing that allows the 35-year-olds to go out by themselves and be effective hunters. And as I say, anyone who's ever tried to make pancakes with a 3-year-old grandchild can tell you that it is not as efficient as if you just do it yourself. Okay, so the last point, the general point I want to make, is that if you're looking at intelligence in general, and this beautiful novella by Ted Chiang really illustrates this kind of developmental diversity, having a life history, having different kinds of capacities, particularly explore, exploit, and care capacities, that's going to be the crucial thing if you actually want intelligence in a high dimensional, non-stationary environment, the sort of intelligence that human beings have. And let me stop by acknowledging all of the mothers and scientific caregivers who are both scientific children and scientific caregivers who are behind this work. And have some time for
First of all, I'm grateful that you've highlighted the virtues of menopause. It's usually not a.
I also like the fact that whenever I talk about postmenopausal grandmothers to the tech bros, they kind of have shake too. First, it's not general intelligence, and then postmenopausal grandmothers. Ooh.
Okay, so that's a very good thing. I was particularly, I mean, I love, there's lots of things to think about, I think, for CETI, where because we do have multi-generation, even though we don't have huge numbers, to see really from this perspective that you pointed out. I was curious about the slide where you talked about the noisiness, saying that the noisiness is very highly correlated with better exploration of opportunities and better learning. Like, what would you think, I assume you discuss this with a lot of AI folks, is a way to introduce this type of noisiness into the system to increase exploration. So, you know, we've been talking in this project often about playback, and we always kind of playback with the whales. And we always, so far at least, shied away from it because of ethical reasons, whatever, which we don't understand anyway. But I wonder if that would be some kind of an unusual thing to introduce, and especially for the young whales, not later. I don't know, it's just thoughts during your talk. And I was wondering about the noisiness, if you're just saying it's just observational, or this leads to a different advice of how to teach, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one of the, I think I mentioned this, Shafi, before, that one reason for talking to people at Simons about this is my understanding is when I talk to people in AI and I say, well, how do you do this temperature thing? What they say is, well, we fiddle the dials until we get something that works. So is there a general principle about how much noise you need, how noise is related to exploration, when you want it, when you don't want it? And as far as I can tell, there's very little, you know, work that actually, even though everyone sort of has the intuition, most of the time it's bad, but some of the time it's good. There isn't really a systematic account of it. And I think that would be very relevant for lots of people, but certainly for this group. And it's certainly true. Now, the thing that's tricky is that if you look at kids, just 3-year-olds, you know, part of what's wonderful about kids is that they say the darndest things, right? They say all these strange things, and they seem to be able to get the place that is the sort of sweet spot between just producing something that's random versus just producing the thing that's the thing that you would have predicted the most. And again, in the context of LLMs, for instance, this is very relevant because, of course, what LLMs do is do the most predictable thing. And the kids often will do the least predictable thing, but not something that's really just random. One of the wonderful things about being a grandmother is you get videos of your grandchild every morning. So I got one this morning of my 3-year-old, and he had a big piece of paper, and he said, I'm writing about how the unicorns have their house. And he had like these pseudo letters that he was writing. This is how the unicorns have their house. No railways. Now I'm writing no railways, right? And all of us can kind of think, okay, you could sort of see why the unicorns might not want railways in their house, but, you know, GPT is not going to have as the continuation of the unicorn's house not having any railways. So I think that question about like what is the right kind of level of noise, what makes it not random, is really, really a deep question for AI.
Hi, thanks. I love the talk. I'm so happy you brought all those topics up. So with cetaceans, I study dolphin behavior and development. And one of the things that I found really helpful was giving them more choice and control, or what you termed empowerment.
Oh, cool.
And we learned a lot. We talked about that last time we were here. And I'm just wondering, given the CETI project, what, do you think that would be helpful to give them some form of empowerment? You have animals that are curious.
Yeah.
Said dolphins certainly are. I don't know as much about sperm whales if you see curiosity and exploration, but that might be an interesting way of learning something. And the question is, how do you do that? How do you give them choice and control? I just wanted to bring it up because you brought that up. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is my empowerment is my new academic crush. It has a very technical, interesting technical definition in the context of reinforcement learning. And interestingly, it started out in sort of Santa Fe Institute evolutionary biology kind of context. So the idea is you have an organism, it has actuators and it has sensors, right? And you want to say what's the right reward for an organism that's like that. And the argument is having high mutual information between actuators and sensors, or between actions and outcomes, right, is a good signal for empowerment. So if you try to get there to be as much mutual information between your actions and their outcomes as possible, independent of the utility of the outcomes, what that does is give you this wide repertoire of actions. And that means if you're in a non-stationary environment and now you've got a new goal, now you've got a new utility, a new thing to do. And again, this is, whales and dolphins are doing this all the time. You sort of have a repertoire in your mind of this is the kind of thing that I could do to bring about this kind of outcome. And I'm also interested in it because I think it's very closely related to causal learning, which is something that I've looked at for a long time. So I think actually, if you think back to that study with the rats, I think exactly, as it were, what the moms are doing is allowing the rats to discover this high mutual information between their actions and outcomes. And if you're thinking about care, those care relationships include, I think, our care for the non-human environment, right? And what does that mean? Well, it might mean trying to get them to maximize the utilities we think they should have, or it might mean even trying to get them, to maximize the utilities that that they have. But really, I think this is a good argument that what it means is empowering them. What it means is giving them an opportunity to discover as many different kinds of capacities as possible. And I think it'd be very interesting to think about what could you actually do in caring for animals that would have that effect.
Can I have one more second?
Yes, please.
Because one of the things that a lot of us are concerned with when we do field work and these kinds of study are the ethics, how we approach it. We've talked a lot about that. And as you were talking, I was thinking, wow, maybe we could do something where you started simply by even just saying, if you play a certain signal or something shown, that then you would move away from the animals or come towards, it's
yeah.
Control even about our proximity, our relationship. That might be a really interesting way to start. We did something like that with dolphins where I didn't want to dive into a dolphin pool. And instead I sat at the edge, and if they touched my foot, I would go in. If not, I stayed out. And they started touching my foot more, and it made me feel better about getting in there. So simple ways of just asking those kinds of questions. Anyway, just thank you for your talk. I just love it.
Well, when you're thinking about again, this is with this empowerment lens. If you look at babies, it turns out that go back to the 70s, and there was this wonderful set of human babies, of studies that showed that human babies are, and this is interesting in terms of sort of origins of communication, are very captivated by contingent interactions between themselves and a caregiver. And there's no content to the interactions, and there's no utility. If anyone who's had a 1-month-old, you hold the 1-month-old up in front of your face and you say, oh, you're such a sweet baby, aren't you? And the baby goes, oh, blah, blah, blah. And you can show that it's that contingency between what the baby's doing and what the other person is doing. That's the thing that is actually motivating the babies. And you can see it's a kind of proto communication. So I think it would be extremely interesting to see whether, if you can sort of set up, the babe, now the dolphin is acting, and then you're doing something contingent on what the dolphin is doing, again, independent of utilities, that my intuition is that the dolphins would really like that and like to do more of that, but it's an empirical question.
Well, the dolphins do that. We've tested and published.
Oh, yeah.
That's why I'm thinking for SETI, it could be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I'll like to talk about it some more as well. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I think
someone else already had that.
I have the mic real quick. thank you for the presentation. I thought it was fascinating. I have two young girls, and I'm thinking, oh, I understand them so much better now. Question I had is, I'm not an expert in this space, so maybe it's a naive question, but I can think of at least one animal species that is generally regarded as intelligent that seems to maybe not apply. Exactly. So in terms of, the development time to getting to self-sufficiency, parental investment, caregiver investment, and
why do you see
being
this?
in a social environment that allows for cultural transmission and learning. So for octopus or octopi, is it that these do apply, but in non-obvious ways, or are there other drivers of intelligence for that species that can also underpin how intelligence emerges?
Yeah. So Peter Godfrey Smith was just at our last workshop, which was irritating for me because I usually have cute videos of kids, and then he had cute videos of octopuses, and it completely dominated the cute videos of kids. So we've talked about, he's an old friend, and we've talked about this a lot. This is completely a Gesso story, but here's the Gesso story that I would tell, but also relevant. So one very good way of solving these tensions is to have a single organism that has different developmental stages, because you don't have a free rider problem. It's me in the future who is going to be taking advantage of the exploration that I do now. But another way that, for example, insects seem to solve this problem is by, and actually human adults in complicated societies, is by having a division of labor. So you have, scouting bees, and you have different levels of scouting, and then you have workers. You actually have this distributed across the community, and you have, explorer children like the people in this room, you have scientists, and then you have people who actually take the science and put it to work to do something. My complete Gesso story about the cephalopods is that one of the things that's really interesting about them is they have this distributed brain, right? So everybody says, gee, it's really strange. It's like they have 9 brains. They have 1 brain in the center, and then they have 8 brains, one in each arm. And if you look at their behavior, it looks like the arms are doing the exploration and the head is doing the exploitation. So the arms are out there getting all sorts of information, and now it's time to actually escape. And the middle brain is saying, okay, now we're all in a coordinated way going to disappear. So my image is, it's like, when you see preschool teachers with, that have the little ropes that are holding on to all the kids, and you see the teacher in the middle and all the kids running around, and the teacher trying to get the kids to move down the street. That's my vision of the cephalopods, but I have no idea if this is actually true. But the division of labor point, I do think, is important, again, especially for complicated social animals.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. When you were describing the exploit mode, the children's way of engaging the explore mode, that made me remember how design thinking workshops are run, right? They try to get you into a beginner's mind, right? And that also brought up the memories of those workshops and the role that the place of play among adults. So it's not just a development. I know that you're focusing on the developmental arc of all these skills, but adults also shift from exploit to explore and back, depending on the rules of the game. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on the role of play and how that could give some interesting hints about research with whales and other animals that may be interacting very differently and communicating very differently depending on the context of whether it's locating food, looking for food, or playing. Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. And it is true both that you see, and we did a big project about this at one point about, the sort of cognitive science of play. It is true both that you see more play in younger animals sort of across a wide range of, pretty much universally, you see more play in younger animals. But it's also true that one of the things about highly intelligent animals is that they characteristically play. And it's interesting, and I don't know if this is true with dolphins, but it's true with humans, that they sort of have markers to say, this is a play context as opposed to this is a serious context. Because again, there's these intrinsic trade-offs. If you interpret what's play as if it's serious, you're really going to get it wrong about what the utilities of the animal are. So at least for humans, we have these things like, okay, it's the weekend, or now I'm going on a retreat where I'm just going to meditate and I'm not going to try and do anything. Or
actually, this is not entirely a joke. I think it is true that I'll take a drug like psilocybin that will have and literally has the effect of returning your brain back to something that's much more like that early plastic state. And I'll do that in a particular context. And I think it would be very interesting, and I don't know what the answer is, about whether animals are giving clues to one another about, oh no, this, and you can see for something like fighting, which is a really common form of play in at least other primates, getting a signal that says, no, this is not a serious fight. This is a play fight could be really important. And I'd love to see what people actually think is empirically there as this kind of
Thank you very much, Alison, for such a inspiring and informative talk. And honestly, there's so much dialogue that created. We could continue this now over lunch. And one thing that we didn't get to share too is that nice thing is that CETI recently, actually a year ago now, witnessed a sperm whale being born.
Oh, how wonderful.
And we have a very nice longitudinal data set, which several people in the room have been poring over. So we would also probably love to pick your brains on that.
That would be a great thing to have, because one of the things that's always been sort of frustrating is not knowing more about what the developmental trajectory is.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So what do we have? We have